Welcome to Single Malt History with Gareth Russell, pouring out your serving of pure, distilled, intoxicating, and occasionally delicious history. Every day at about noon, a crew member pinned a set of statistics to the daily chart to let first-class passengers know the projected state of the weather and how far the ship had travelled in the last 24-hour period. At midday, on the clear, calm and breezily fresh Friday the 12th of April, the chart informed the Titanic's passengers that they had all moved 386 miles after leaving Queenstown the day before. With no port of call to break the journey, everybody knew that the mileage would be up by the same time tomorrow. We're so familiar with the image of modern cruise ships, chock full of entertainment, seemingly never-ending. But that really wasn't the way things were done on ocean liners before the First World War. In fact, apart from the occasional musical concert in the afternoon or after dinner, you were pretty much left to entertain yourself. So sometimes passengers took to organising things like sweepstakes, betting to see to the closest mile who could accurately guess how far the ship would travel from one day to the next. But beware of picking a fellow passenger to hold the betting tin, because some professional gamblers and confidence tricksters travel on ships hoping to fleece the wealthy clientele. So it might be better to leave the daily pot with the purser or his staff in their office on sea deck. We'll come back to them later. I mentioned in yesterday's podcast on day 2 of the Titanic's voyage, which I tried to use to cover life in second class, that second class was at about 50% capacity for the Titanic's inaugural voyage. In part, this half capacity really did have to do with the time of year. April crossings were never as popular as those in summer, and after the recent miners' strike in Britain, many passengers were nervous about booking tickets until the last minute in case yet more voyages were cancelled because of a sudden lack of coal for the ship's boiler rooms because of the strike. First class was even less jam-packed on the Titanic. I know, often it's assumed or even shown in some dramas that the Titanic was fully booked, but it wasn't. At capacity, the Titanic had room for just over 900 first-class passengers, but on this particular trip, her first, in April 1912, she was sailing with only 324 first-class passengers, meaning that her grandest section was about 2/3 empty. Of these 324 people in first class, the overwhelming majority were American citizens, 212 out of a total of 324, while only 48 were British. The reason for this particular breakdown in nationalities is because of a particular feature of upper-class life that bordered almost on quasi-religious importance in the years before the First World War. It was something known as the season, capital S if you don't mind. For both the British and the American upper classes, it was a time when they all grouped together in certain locations to summer, and that's a verb in this case. For the British, it meant moving to one's townhouse in London to attend a series of socialising events with one's fellow aristocrats or blue bloods over the course of the summer months. Grand balls and luncheons and garden parties would be given. And in fact, some of the public entertainment set up for the season in London still survive today. Wimbledon for the tennis, the Royal Chelsea Flower Show, the Henley Royal Regatta being 3 examples. This busy summer socialising season in London meant that very few British upper-class people had any interest in leaving their country in April because it was so close to the start of the season. In contrast, for wealthy Americans, they were hoping to get home in time for the start of theirs, which in 1912, it's a little bit different. Some places like the Hamptons kind of still refer to it, and they would start a little earlier than they did in 1912. But in 1912, it ran from May 30th through to the first Monday in September. Summer linens, hats and fashion were trotted out as the well-to-do decamped to their summer homes. If anyone's a fan of Friends and hasn't yet done the impression, when Phoebe is doing that kind of Katharine Hepburn, I think it's called the Lockjaw Locust accent properly, and she says, "Where does everyone summer?" while she's trying to impress Mike's parents, I think it is. That is making fun of this set and summer as a verb. So whole villages on the coasts were developed because of the season into elite summer spots. That's how the Hamptons developed for the New York set, Cape Cod for old money Bostonians. There were spots in New Jersey, Rhode Island and Delaware. And the desire to get back home for the season explains why, or at least helps explain why, Americans outnumbered the British by 5-1 in the Titanic's first-class passenger list. Although it wasn't sailing anywhere near full capacity, the Titanic's ability to transport about 900 first-class ticket holders at peak season helps refute a very common alleged fact that we hear about the Atlantic passenger trade at this time, which is that the shipping companies really only turned a profit from third class or steerage. If that was true, they would only have offered third class on their ships. They were businesses. They turned a profit from all three classes. That's why they provided them. What we instead notice with first class, particularly on the larger and more modern ships, is that capacity was significantly increased in a short period of time because more and more wealthy people were interested in regular travel between Europe and America. The White Star Line wanted to capitalize on that, which is why the Titanic had room for 1,100 in third class and 900 in first. That's not a substantial margin of difference. In fact, the Olympic and the Titanic really pushed the travelling capacity for first class further than it had gone before, which speaks to this trend of more wealthy people travelling more frequently. As part of this tactic, White Star Line also offered different grades of cabin for those wanting to travel in first class. Not all 900 first-class passengers travelled in the height of luxury when it came to where they slept. The two most expensive rooms were the so-called... Oh, how embarrassing. Why? Was it yesterday the day before I tripped over the word Paris and the word cold fell me? Oh, alright, anyway. The two most expensive rooms were the so-called promenade suites on B deck, areas that had several luxurious bedrooms, a private promenade or veranda space, a parlour, bathrooms, a loo, and a significant amount of wardrobe space. Elsewhere on B deck and on C deck below it, there were parlour suites with a bedroom, a parlour or drawing room, wardrobe space, and bathroom facilities. Staterooms, located on B, C, or D deck, were decorated in a kaleidoscope of styles, maybe Georgian, Old, or Modern Dutch, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI. Louis XVII wasn't king for long enough, and no one liked Louis XVIII. Interestingly, these staterooms typically didn't have their own bathroom, more specifically, their own toilet. This shocks a lot of modern readers, but it wasn't until 26 years after the Titanic, until a Dutch luxury liner called the New Amsterdam entered service, that ensuite facilities were offered as standard with all first-class cabins. Before that, passengers typically shared toilet facilities, a bit like the ones we expect to see in an upscale restaurant. And if you wanted to take a bath, there was a bath steward that you booked the bathroom through if you didn't have access to a suite, which offered your own private one in a suite, obviously. There was also a lot of cheaper cabins in first class, principally but not exclusively located on A or E deck, that were decently decorated, if pretty Spartan, with plain wooden bedsteads, white or dark walls, and essential pieces of furniture like a chest of drawers and a chair. This all meant that there was a significant variance in how much different first-class passengers paid based on their rooms. However, they all had access to the same public spaces. What were those like? Well, come with me on a metaphorical nautical podcast tour. After a stroll on the boat deck, capped by the ship's enormous yellow and black funnels and framed by the ship's white-painted wooden lifeboats, all of which were covered with canvas to guard against rain, you might pop into the gymnasium. Or, like me, you'll say you'll pop into the gymnasium and never quite get around to it. When you do, you'll find an instructor, exercise equipment like rowing machines and exercise bikes, and a diagram of the ship. There was also an electrical horse, which looks, I think, faintly demonic. It was essentially just a disembodied saddle that you sat on, I think, to tone your muscles. Next door to the gymnasium, you can access it, is the entrance to one of the most famous architectural features of the 20th century, the Titanic's grand staircase. In fact, there's two of them. One further forward and one aft, or closer to the back. The cabin corridors generally run between the two sets of staircases, while the ship's public rooms generally sit on the other side of the staircases. I'm being a bit reductive, but hopefully that gives you a general idea of the layout. Leaving the boat deck and walking beneath the staircase's great glass dome past the famous clock and then down to the Cherub, you'll descend to A deck, where passengers can read, borrow books, have tea or coffee and socialise in a lounge inspired by the 18th century private apartments of King Louis XV of France at the Palace of Versailles. Although it's splendid, actually, an industry journal in 1911 would call the lounge one of, if not the most splendid room yet put to sea. The lounge doesn't seem to be one of the most popular rooms with first-class passengers. It might actually be a bit too grand. It feels formal in comparison to, sort of more functionally cozy rooms. Cozy used in a sort of sybaritic sense, I suppose. On the same deck, there is a reading and writing room with rose-coloured carpets, writing desks, comfortable armchairs, an electric fireplace, potted plants, and views over the deck. It's only for the use of female passengers, and so the smoking room, also on A deck, was solely for men. Inspired by the private clubs in London or New York, the smoking room's a mahogany-lined room, decorated with gold and mother-of-pearl details. Leather armchairs and card tables sit beneath stained glass windows. There's a bar, and for safety's sake, the ship's only wood-burning or coal-burning fireplace. Further aft or further back, there are two veranda cafes. Imagine a conservatory and you've got the aesthetic. One permits smoking over your snacks. The other, which is more popular with mothers and their children, does not. From A deck, you can either take the stairs or one of the 3 bellboy-manned elevators to B deck. Here, there is yet another cafe, the Café Parisian, or Café Parisian, depending on which side of the Atlantic you hail from. This was a new feature on the Titanic, which had several improvements made from her sister, the Olympic, who had made her ocean-going debut the previous summer. My hunch, for what it's worth, is that this French-style coffee house was introduced to keep the Titanic as a hearty rival to the German transatlantic liners like the Kronprinzessin Cecily. Ask me how I got that, but got the word cold wrong, and I will have no viable answer. So yes, like the Kronprinzessin Cecily, which offered first-class passengers a Café Vienna. Pinching the idea identically would look a bit obvious from the White Star Line, so Vienna became Paris on the Titanic as coffee and pastries were wheeled out to first-class passengers who took advantage of the Café Parisien's magnificent views. By B-deck, there were no outdoor deck spaces. You'd sort of entered the hull by this stage, or more or less. So the row of windows looked out uncluttered directly onto the passing ocean, sky, sun, or stars. Next door, there was another French-inspired gastronomic delight in a gorgeous restaurant with the air of Marie Antoinette's weekend country house at the Petit Trianon. Walnut-lined walls, rose carpets, fawn chairs in the style of the late 18th century, all bathed in the soft light of individual table lamps. The restaurant, too, existed solely to keep pace with the Germans, who had introduced this technique on their liners a few years earlier. A first-class ticket traditionally entitles you to breakfast, lunch and dinner 2 decks below in the dining saloon, where you have your seat assigned by the purser and your food assigned by the kitchen. Everyone starts at the same time in the saloon and eats off the same menu. It's a bit like going to a dinner party 7 nights in a row. But here in the restaurant, you can eat when you like and order what you like off a menu, and you settle your bill for it like you would at a restaurant on land. It's not included in your ticket price. To make reservations in the restaurant, make your way down to C deck. It's mostly accommodation here for first class, but you can make reservations for the restaurant, the Turkish Bath, the swimming pool, and the squash courts here at the purser's office. Ladies can deposit their jewellery in the purser's safe, collecting them and redepositing them every day before and after they wear them at dinner. The purser himself, Hugh McElroy, is a sort of mini captain, although he has nothing to do with the navigation. He is king of the accommodation side of Titanic. We might call him head of hospitality, if it weren't so singularly unnautical a term. A deck below is the reception room, one of the Titanic's most popular spots. There's a Steinway piano, a tapestry inspired by one that used to belong to Mary, Queen of Scots' family. Wicker chairs, sofas and settees dot the room. The band plays here at 4 o'clock every day while afternoon tea is served. They then head over to perform for second class, but they're back in first class to entertain passengers over drinks or post-dinner coffee. Passengers were provided with a White Star Company songbook that listed each piece in the band's repertoire. Each song is also numbered for convenience in this book, so you give the song number to the band when you're requesting they play your favourite tune, and that actually is where we get the tradition of referring to a song as a number. The reception room leads into the dining saloon, one of the largest rooms afloat. It's also become one of the most famous rooms on the Titanic, thanks to fairly accurate depictions of it in movies like James Cameron's Titanic and the 1958 adaptation of A Night to Remember. 2 decks below, on F deck, there is a Turkish bath with treatments that are also charged as extra to the ticket. Some passengers detested the experience, calling it exhausting. Others adored the scrub down in this gorgeously overwrought space, very loosely inspired by the decoration of the Sultan's palaces in Istanbul. Using the swimming pool next door worked in different shifts for men and women, and various health fads were available, like the electric baths, which were cylinder pieces of metal that promised to tan you up, slim you down, improve circulation, improve your colour, reduce your tan. Contradictory things, all of which could be achieved while you sweated within the cylinder. Also on F deck was the very popular squash court. A ship of the Titanic's size with so many amenities and pieces of equipment meant that there was quite a lot of potential for things to go wrong, especially on a first voyage. I realise now reading that out that, things going wrong on the voyage of the Titanic is kind of what it's known for, but I mean in this case the more run-of-the-mill inconveniences. To combat this, the Titanic's builders, Harland and Wolff, had sent a 9-man guarantee group on first voyages, and their job was to take care of every issue that arose on the first voyage to New York, be it big or small, fixing what they could and writing detailed reports for the shipyard back in Belfast. Thomas Andrews was a 39-year-old managing director of Harland and Wolff, a workaholic with an obsessive eye for detail, softly spoken and adored by his workers for his consideration for their living and working conditions. He had been born in the village of Cumber, 11 miles outside Belfast, and educated at the Royal Belfast Academical Institute, then and now nicknamed Inst, in the city, after which he rose through the ranks at Harland and Wolff. Along with many of Belfast's wealthiest citizens at the time, he owned a townhouse in the southern quarter of the city, lining the affluent Malone Road, where he lived with his wife Helen, their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and their 4 servants. As someone who had helped design the Titanic, Thomas Andrews seemingly knew every inch of the great ship. But by Friday afternoon, even Thomas Andrews' love for his job could not distract him from just how much he missed his family back home in Belfast. He was painfully homesick, and this became really clear to one of his colleagues, Mary Sloane, on Friday evening. Thomas Andrews ate his meals in the dining saloon with the other first-class passengers. He shared a table with the purser and the ship's Irish onboard doctor, Dr. William O'Loughlin. Mary Sloane was a stewardess who also worked with the first-class passengers, which meant she, of course, couldn't eat with them. She was going about her chores just before dinner on Friday evening when she bumped into Dr. O'Loughlin in the reception room. He was waiting at the foot of the staircase for Thomas Andrews so they could go in to dinner together in the dining saloon. I have to say, I have a soft spot for Mary Sloane. She survived the sinking of the Titanic 3 days later, and when she was subsequently interviewed by journalists, she gave her age as 28. However, while researching my book on the Titanic, I found 2 censuses conducted by His Majesty's government which confirm that Mary was in fact 43, and I have nothing but admiration for that exercise in self-branding to the journalists. The census also confirms that Mary Sloane was not just from Belfast, but more specifically from the northern quarter of the city, and so I am doubly delighted that her eyewitness testimony is being read for us today by actress Ashley Montgomery, who is also from North Belfast. Meant to be. Here is Ashley reading Mary's letter about Friday the 12th of April and what she saw just before dinner from Dr. O'Loughlin and Thomas Andrews.
I was talking to Mr. Andrews on the ship on the Friday night previous as he was going in to dinner. the dear old doctor. Dr. O'Loughlin was waiting for him by the stair landing. I'm to call him Mr. Andrews by his Christian name, Tommy. Mr. Andrews seemed loath to go into the dining saloon, but he wanted to talk about home. He was telling me his father was ill and Mrs. Andrews was not so well herself. I was congratulating him on the beauty and perfection of the ship. He said the part he did not like was that the Titanic was taking us further away from home every hour. I was proud of him. He came from home and he made you feel on the ship that all was all right. And he was always the same. A nod and a smile or a hearty word whenever he saw you, no matter what he was at.
As mentioned, dinner in the saloon started at the same time. That's why in Titanic movies you'll often see scenes of the first-class passengers congregating in the reception room together before going into dinner, and options on the menu were fairly limited inside. At best, with each course, you'd have a choice between two options. Because dinner was such a social opportunity, they really stretched it out, and dinner was the big event of the ship-going day. Dinner in the dining saloon that Friday began with hors d'oeuvre and oysters, then a soup course, at which the choice was usually between a light consommé or something heavier. In this case, on the Friday, the Titanic's passengers chose between a consommé Sévigné or a crème condé. Halibut was served for the fish course, followed by a choice between duck and lobster. With the same course, a lighter vegetarian option was also offered, mushroom vol au vent. For the next course, vegetables only appeared on the side of sirloin, rooster, or a haunch of mutton before what I can only assume after all this was an epically pointless salad course. Dessert was ice cream, pineapple royale, or friandaise cake. And so even if portions were generally kept relatively small with each course, if you were hoping to stay trim, this was a marathon-level test of endurance. In the dining saloon, several first-class passengers skipped courses or grazed at those they did take. At dinner that night, there was best-selling novelist Jacques Futrelle. Fellow first-class passengers included Broadway producer Henry Harris, art historian Helen Churchill Candy, her friend Moritz Håkan Bjornstam Stephenson, got that right, handsome heir to a Swedish manufacturing fortune, former British Olympic silver medalist Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, and his Canadian wife Lucy, one of the most innovative and celebrated fashion designers in the world. American silent movie star Dorothy Gibson dined with her faintly terrifying mother Pauline. There was disgraced London investment banker Hugh Woolner, the strikingly elegant Countess of Rothes, whose friends on land included members of the British royal family and who had decided to skip the London season so she could celebrate her 12th wedding anniversary in America with her husband, the Earl of Rothes, while he was on a mission for the British government. Back on land, the Countess was also a prominent campaigner against Irish independence from Britain and for British women to be given the right to vote. American historian Colonel Archibald Gracie IV was hard to miss in the dining saloon. Likewise for the improbably spectacular moustache of his fellow Colonel John Jacob Astor, also a fourth in the line, one of the richest men in the world, and a veteran of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Wine flowed, courses appeared and disappeared as passengers chatted in the dining saloon, perhaps wondering how much they should bet on how far the mighty Titanic would have travelled by noon tomorrow. Speaking of tomorrow, do please tune in and subscribe or follow so you can hear about dropping temperatures and rising speed for Saturday, April 13th. And we'll discuss whether or not a psychic novelist predicted the Titanic disaster in a book 14 years before it happened. Wishing you a very pleasant rest of your day wherever you are, and thank you for listening, and in particular thank you to Ashley Montgomery for lending her time and talent to bring to life the words of crew member Mary Sloan.